Today in the EU, does the EU need two parliament seats? It was 2019 when German slam poet and former MEP Nico Semsrott said he found a way to cut by millions EU costs.
I made European history. How? I found a loophole in the treaty provision that determines the parliament's seat.
According to those treaties' provisions, members of the European Parliament must meet in Strasbourg 12 times a year. Semsrott claimed that the Brussels Parliamentary Plenary could be renamed as Strasbourg, and he did it by using a post-it note. The intention behind Semsrott's provocative move was simple: highlight all the ways in which the Strasbourg seat was a waste of money.
It costs €500 million per legislative period.
Time.
You all lose 100 hours a year traveling to France and back.
And carbon emissions.
Most importantly, the second seat is a waste of planet Earth. Every year you emit 20,000 tons of CO2 traveling to Strasbourg, where you meet to declare a climate emergency.
Now, Semsrott's stunt ended up forgotten, but the question remains: do we really need two parliaments, one of which is empty 300 days a year? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. To talk about it, I am joined in the studio by Troy Davis, activist and president of the Association for European Democracy. Hi, Troy.
Hi.
I think that in order to fully understand the issue, it's important to provide the historical background. Why does the parliament move between Strasbourg and Brussels?
Yes, the reasons it moved are because the parliament started in Strasbourg. In fact, the first time that it met ever was on September 10th, 1952. It wasn't called the European Parliament at the time. It was called the Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community. It's literally the same organization, which changed name 10 years later in 1962. Then there were direct elections in 1979.
Yes, and why did they originally choose Strasbourg? Why did they meet there?
The reason why it met in Strasbourg was because it had the largest hemicycle at the time, because of the creation of the Council of Europe. And you might say, well, why was the Council of Europe chosen for Strasbourg? Ironically, it was a British foreign minister, Ernest Bevin, who proposed that Strasbourg be the seat of the new European institutions post-war to maintain the peace, because Strasbourg was considered a more neutral city between France and Germany, and a sort of a martyred city, which had no political ambitions, and it was a symbol of the necessary reconciliation between France and Germany that was needed to make European peace.
And so the value is rather symbolic.
It was a symbolic choice, a historical choice, but as we know, when you create history, especially when you want to create peace, you have to have a story that has meaning. People need meaning in life, and they especially need meaning in politics. It has to make sense.
Since the early 2000s, there have been proposals to cut down costs of European institutions and scrap the parliament in Strasbourg. When did you first hear about it?
In 2006, I was at the European Parliament and I was doing lobbying for the School of Democracy. And I noticed that there were 3 campaigns against Strasbourg. I knew there had been some discussions about this, but I wasn't really much aware of it because I had been away for a long time. And I realized, okay, well, that's interesting. There are 3 campaigns against Strasbourg. And then I said, there must be one for Strasbourg. And I looked around and people said, no, there isn't. I said, that's crazy. Why is nobody advocating for what I thought was the best option?
And why do you think that is the best option?
Well, whether you believe in one option or the other, at least there has to be an honest debate. And that's a problem with this. There seems to be kind of a blind spot, even a taboo about this, that everybody thinks, oh my God, Brussels must be the place. But no, Brussels doesn't have to be a place. If we are rational, we look at 2 options and we evaluate 2 options on different criteria. And first we have to decide criteria, and then we make the decision at the end. That's the rational way of doing things. It seems that in this debate, nobody does this. Neither the French government, nor the Belgian government, nor even the court in Luxembourg, because a logical way of doing things would have been, there's a waste of what is called, the wandering circus, the Wanderzirkus or circambulant in French. And if there's a waste, then logically you either have to put everything in Strasbourg or everything in Brussels, right? So then what the court said, many people say, they illogically say if there's a waste, we must automatically put it in Brussels. That makes no sense. Logically, there are two options. They just literally dismiss the Strasbourg option from the start without even thinking about its advantages or disadvantages. So what we need to do, we need to have a objective, rational, open process to say, okay, what are the advantages of the Strasbourg option and disadvantages? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the Brussels options and compare them?
Well, at the same time, it is out of debate that having MEPs meet 12 times per year in Strasbourg increases incredibly the carbon emissions attributed to political work. What do you think about it?
Actually, this is a red herring because we, AGAN is an organization, and I should specify that I'm the president of the Organization for European Democracy. This is the organization which does lobbying for the parliament in Strasbourg as part of a promotion of European democracy. Now, why is it a red herring? Because we are against this wandering circus. We do not want people to go back and forth. We say that for many reasons, they should be in Strasbourg rather than Brussels. So once you have established that, you don't have the wandering circus anymore. But even so, if you look at the numbers, the actual CO2 emissions are basically nothing compared to the CO2 emissions of the parliament in general. If you know the way the parliament works, you know that the political groups, they meet all around the world. And usually they meet in kind of exotic, nice locations. They meet in Cyprus, they meet in even outside of Europe.
Okay, but let's be concrete. In terms of cost, this wandering circus, the commute between Brussels and Strasbourg, now is around 100 million a year, a bit more. What would be the reason to maintain the second seat or to switch everything to Strasbourg?
Yes, the reason to maintain the parliament in Strasbourg, or the real reason, and it should not be a cost issue, but even on the cost, by the way, we have a parliament in Strasbourg which functions, which is great, and so forth. The parliament in Brussels is out of date, must be renovated. We estimate it will cost about €1 billion to fix it. You can just scrap the building or you sell it to private organizations. You save yourself an entire building. You keep some offices, of course, as liaison and so forth, but you do not need to have two hemicycles. And besides, also for the people in Brussels, it's horrible. They have literally destroyed historical districts because of that. They've raised the prices. Many local people, they hate that.
But wouldn't those same concerns then apply to the citizens of Strasbourg?
No, because first of all, we have already absorbed that for years. We have the parliament, and if you look at where it is in the city, it's not in the center of the city. It is on the outskirts. It is next to the biggest park. The location is sort of out of the way. By the way, this is also a security issue in Brussels. One of the advantages of Strasbourg, which people call a disadvantage, is that it's a smaller city. We literally have less crime. But put all that aside, all those practical reasons, if you calculated the CO2 emissions, let's say everybody around Europe flying to Brussels, everybody flying to Strasbourg, you have less CO2 emissions flying into Strasbourg because it's more central to the center of Europe. Brussels is on the edge of Western Europe.
Beyond environmental and monetary costs, why should the Strasbourg Parliament remain where it is? Let's focus on the bigger picture.
The big picture is that Europe is not a single country. It's not going to be a single country. It should not be a unitary single country like France. I am French. And unfortunately, as we know, people say historically, Europe was built through the French basically leading the way and the Germans paying the bills. Okay? Now, Europe must be diverse. It is diverse. It must stay diverse. Right now, we have three capitals. We have Strasbourg as a legislative capital. We have Brussels as the executive capital. We have Luxembourg as the judiciary capital. So the separation of powers, which is a hallmark of democracy, is incorporated in the geographical separation. This is very important. We also have a problem in Europe that people do not feel themselves European. There are many people who are Eurosceptics. In fact, we have now with the new elections, we see it. We have a huge rightward move of the European Parliament.
Right.
Why? Because many people do not like Europe. We had Brexit. And so it is very important to be closer to the people. Many people speak about the so-called democratic deficit. Whether it's reality or not, if people think there's a democratic deficit, that's a problem. Now imagine, as the majority of, in some circles, people just want to move everything to Brussels. Imagine we do that. Now what's going to happen? That means that we would have all institutions, nearly all institutions, but for practical purposes, people forget about Luxembourg, in Brussels. That means Brussels would be a dominant center of Europe, and people hate that. In fact, when people speak about a super state, they never think of Strasbourg, they think of Brussels. When people want to insult, quote unquote, the EU, they never mention Strasbourg, they mention Brussels. Now, this is very dangerous. We cannot put our eggs in the same basket. That's why 3 capitals for 3 powers. We have 3 capitals, Strasbourg, Brussels, Luxembourg, each one the seat of one of the powers, according to Baron Charles de Montesquieu, who theorized separation of powers. Now, this is a healthy separation of power, which is also good, by the way, for what is called continuity of government issues. If you had, let's say, a terrorist attack, worst case, one city was really badly damaged, it's very important for the government to be able to continue to have more than one city. For pure security issues, it's very important.
Thank you, Troy. I'm Giada Santana, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcasts. Leave us a star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite streaming platform. It will really help us spread the word about our work. This episode was produced by Miriam Sanz de Tejada, Nicoletta Yonta, and me. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.